Hello, welcome to our session on Calcite, Esri's design system. Today, we're going to be showing you how you can build beautiful apps faster using Calcite Components. My name is Matt Driscoll, and co-presenting with me today is Juan Carlos Franco. Both Franco and I are software engineers on the ArcGIS JavaScript API team, and we also develop web components for the Calcite design system. So for today's agenda, we're going to introduce Calcite Components, talk about their benefits, go over their foundational building blocks, show how you can start using them, demo some example apps we've built with Calcite, and take any questions you might have. So let's start out with the introduction and get to know Calcite Components. So Calcite is Esri's design system, and its purpose is to provide a visual language for products. And these kind of things include design guidelines, such as how color should be, what spacing there should be, typography, fonts, stuff like that. It also includes graphic resources, such as icons, symbols, and a sketch UI kit. It includes interactive documentation that also provides you as a developer with patterns and best practices. And it includes reusable Calcite components. And all of this kind of closes the gap between designers and UI engineers. So there's more of an understanding on how things should look and how things should work and how people do that. And it will be releasing later this month. So Calcite Components. They are a library of web components for the Calcite design system. There's over 50 that we have right now. They are ready to use and reusable in your apps or in different apps. And they all provide a library of patterns for the components. So we use these components internally in our web applications, but you can also use them externally if you have a developer subscription. And this will allow you to easily and quickly build beautiful apps. So let's go over some of the benefits and why you'd want to use Calcite components. So the first major benefit is consistency. By using these components, you're going to get a consistent user experience. All of them have the Esri identity or look and feel to them. They all follow the same best practices and the same conventions. So there's a familiarity with it. And this provides a clear direction for designers and developers so that they're basically on the same page. Another major benefit is efficiency. So because these are ready to go and use, there's a reduced effort and cost to developing your application. All the apps will follow this agreed upon design workflows that the components and the patterns and all the stuff the design system gives you. And so there's a reduced cost of design updates because they're all using these components. And if the components get updated, then all the designs get updated as well. And so a major benefit of that is being reusable. So you don't have to create a set of components for an application. Let's say you built one like a accordion in a specific framework, and then maybe 5 years down the line that framework's no longer popular. You'd have to kind of reinvent the wheel. Because these are web components, it kind of eliminates that so that they can just be used in any framework. And in the end, it just speeds up development timelines so you can focus on building your app rather than the design of like the common things like menus and accordions. We also provide these components and they're accessible, which means that they follow the W3 accessibility guidelines. So they use semantic elements inside of them. They are keyboard accessible, so they can all be used via keyboard access only. They follow guidelines for color contrast so that users with visual impediments can see them clearly. And we provide text alternatives so that screen readers can use these components as well without having to read some text. And we test all of these components continuously using a CI API called the Axe API by DQ. Last benefit is that these are web components, so they're based on a web standard, which means that they follow the W3C spec and are therefore future-proof, so they'll work in browsers until basically browsers stop following spec, which is forever. So that's a major benefit. Also, because they're web components, we can do things like shadow DOM and encapsulate our styles in HTML so that they're not conflicting with a user's styles in HTML. And this is a benefit so that we're not conflicting our styles with their styles, and it kind of bundles everything together. Another major benefit is that they work just like HTML. So they're basically just custom HTML elements. So as a developer, if you know how to work with HTML and nodes, they're going to be very familiar to you. And also because they're standards-based, they're framework agnostic, so they can be used in any framework and they'll just work. As far as the browsers we support, we're supporting the 4 major browsers: Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Edge. And because all these browsers update automatically, we're going to support the last 2 versions of them. So let's dissect Calcite components a little bit and talk about how they're built and what they're composed of. So the foundations of Calcite components are Calcite Colors. And this is a set of Esri official colors, or a color palette. And these colors also include a light and a dark theme to them. So you can easily switch your application between a light and a dark mode. They also, another building block is Calcite Ui Icons. And this is a set of over 700 user interface SVG scalable icons that you can use for your application. So by using these, you'll get a consistent set of icons you can use for things like close buttons, all these kind of icons for toolbars and things. And then coming soon, we'll be releasing a repository for Calcite styles. And this will be a way for us to define things like sizing, spacing, color, typography, shadows in a consistent way. And how we're doing this is using a CSS framework called Tailwind CSS. And that allows us to define these things and use them consistently throughout our application. We are also using CSS Custom Properties for these components, otherwise known as CSS variables. And so we can do things like have a variable for the background of the user interface and reference that through all of our components. And this is how we kind of do theming, where you can specify an override for this CSS variable, and it'll apply to all the components. So now I want to demo some of the building blocks we have. Just a little disclaimer, this documentation is not yet released, so there may be a few little things that aren't quite there yet. But the first thing I want to show is the icon library and then the colors. So if we look at our documentation pages, we'll get an overview and we'll see a section for components as well as an icon library. And by clicking on this, I can go see some of the icons we have available for use in your application. And you can kind of narrow these down by different types of icons. So for example, arrows. And I can also search here at the top and kind of preview them differently. So let's say I need an arrow for a bold right arrow. I can see what it's going to look like at different sizes here. And to use it in my app, all I have to do is copy this HTML and be able to reference it and use it in my application. We also have a number of components that just take the name of this icon and they'll automatically include it and be used in the component. The other section I wanted to point out was under the foundations, we have a page for colors and themes. And this kind of demonstrates the colors we have throughout the design system in both the light and dark theme. So here you'll see the reference to the CSS custom property variable and the color defined for it. And I can also switch to dark theme and see how that differs. Even though it's the same variable name, the color is different. I can also see colors for state, such as things like success or an error message or a warning. I can see guidelines for when to kind of use those information states. I can see the themes in both light and dark. And you'll kind of see that this is our color palette and how things are going to mesh well together and be contrasting for accessibility. And then I see some best practices for how to use colors and when to use them, things to avoid. And if I want, I can get more reference to more colors on the Calcite GitHub for colors. Cool. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Franco, and he's going to cover getting started and how you can start using Calcite components for your project.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, so in this next section, we'll be talking about some of the different concepts that you might need to have in mind before starting to work with Calcite components into your project. So with that said, let's get started. Okay, so I just want to take a step back and talk about what web components are. Like Matt alluded to, the web components are a suite of different technologies, and they are following web standards, and these are provided by modern browsers. They allow us to create reusable custom elements, and we do this so that we can create small pieces of reusable functionality and look and feel, you could say. And then once we have that, it allows us to start distributing easily using them across different applications that we have. And these are also supported by modern browsers. So as long as you have one of the browsers that supports these specs, you are able to use Calcite components. Now, how do we go about creating these components? Well, I'll talk about two of the main specs that we leverage. The first one being custom elements. And what this spec allows us to do is to create elements that inherit from HTML element. And what this allows us to do is to create tags that the browser knows how to work with. So any sort of native APIs that you have access to in the browser, they should be able to work with our components. So if you have a query selector, if you use that API, the Calcite components are compatible with that. It also allows us in the components themselves to access the elements lifecycle. And with that said, we, for example, have access to know when a DOM element is on or off the web page. And this allows us to author web components that are lean and optimized. So if you have a component that is constantly fetching for data, if we know that the component is no longer on the page, we can pause that to kind of free up more resources for the browser. The other spec I want to talk about is the shadow DOM. And this allows us to keep all the HTML structure and styling, the CSS of a component encapsulated. And this prevents the styles from one component affecting another one that might be on the page, or even if the styling of one component affecting something that is external and part of the app, and vice versa. If you have a generic selector at the app level, it won't affect the internal styling of the components. Another neat thing that we get with Shadow DOM is the slot element. And what this does is it gives us an element that we can use inside of a component's HTML structure for inserting content. So it gives you, the developers, the option to possibly replace different parts of some of these components. And we'll see an example of that later. Now, talking about the plug and playability of these components, you can take, for example, you can think of them as native HTML elements, right? So here in this simple snippet, I have a label and with an input, something like you would see on in a typical form. And right below it, I see the elements themselves. If I click on the label, it'll focus on the input, which has a placeholder, and it's marked as required. It has some min and max attributes set on it. Now in Calcite components, we do have equivalents to some of the native HTML elements, and they're all prefixed with Calcite. So all the Calcite components use this Calcite prefix in the tag. That's one way of easily distinguishing them. And now in this updated example using Calcite, you can see it's pretty similar to the previous one, but now you have an experience that is adhering to the Calcite design system principles. So I have the Calcite label here, and it'll focus on the input with the placeholder. If I go back and forth, you can see it's just a matter, it's very close to the original HTML. So that's really cool. It makes it much easier to start transitioning some of the existing HTML that you might have into the Calcite equivalent. Now I'd like to talk about some of the options that you have as developers for configuring some of these components. I'll be talking about slots and properties and attributes. So slots, as we covered in a previous slide, allows you to provide elements or structures that will be inserted inside of an HTML component. And in this example that I have here, I have the Calcite tip. And all that I'm doing here is just setting a heading with some text for my tip, right? Now, this component supports a slot for inserting a thumbnail if you had some sort of image to accompany the text. If I were to update the code to take advantage of this slot, you can see here, just by providing an image element and using the slot attribute, I tell it which slot to use. So what the Calcite tip will do is it'll take a look at this element and then place the image inside of the component structure. It's not really apparent here, but if I would inspect the DOM, you can see there's some spacing around the image here that was slotted in. And that's one of the powerful things that we get with the Calcite components. It allows you to provide custom content straight into the component itself and not have to worry about tweaking the CSS to make stuff align correctly. So whenever possible, the components take all that and they take that responsibility away from you, making it easier to start working on the main code. Now, all the components expose a set of properties or attributes, depending on whether you're using them in JavaScript or through HTML. I just want to cover some of the main ones. The theme is one of the main ones, where it allows all the components support a light and dark theme. And if you remember the example that Matt showed for Calcite Colors, there are two main color schemes that all components adhere to. So it makes it easy to choose between these two themes and have the component automatically apply all the styling. And here I have the light and dark equivalents of the Calcite Select. Next up, if your application has to consider right to left, we also support the direction attribute. So once you set this on the component will mirror its layout for the proper way of displaying in RTL contexts. And here I have the same select with the left to right direction, and the one next to it is following the RTL. You can see everything is in the RTL, following the RTL layout. Now, a lot of our components have default text for some of the different parts inside of it. And we know that not all of the applications will that you write will be focused in English. And the components give you an option to customize these different labels with properties and attributes that are using the INTL prefix. So in this modal example that I have here in this screenshot, if I focus on the top right corner, there's a close button. And by default, if I hover over it, I get a close tooltip. And the text will be in English by default. But if I wanted to change that to Spanish, for example, I could use the INTL close attribute or property if you're using JavaScript to pass along the proper text to be shown when I hover over the close button. So this gives you another option of customization in different locales for each of the components. On a related note, there are some properties that we've covered that allow you to change the. I want to focus now on some additional options that you have along with attributes to customize the appearance of some of these components. So a lot of our components expose properties that allow you to tweak the styling of all these components, right? So in this example, I'm just using the Calcite button with the appearance attribute that will remove the border. I'm telling it to use the gray scheme for its color. And then all the components support 3 different sizing scales. And in this case, I'm using the large one, but it also supports small and medium. I'm also telling it that I want to display a play icon at the end of the button here, and also to display in a round fashion. So just with a few attributes, I get a button that looks like something that I would see in a video or music player. And Matt showed in one of his slides the fact that we use CSS Custom Properties, and that is true for all the components. They are all using these variables to define color. So this is another option that you have access to if you wanted to tweak the different values of these colors. And I have an example here that will show some of these variables that you have access to. And in this page, as I play around with some of these values, you'll see how the components in runtime will update and show the effect of changing that value. Just one way of kind of exploring how the CSS variables will affect our components. And if I go back in this snippet that I have here, I'm using a Calcite loader and through the style property for demo purposes, because you would typically have this in your style sheet. But all that I'm doing here is overriding some of the colors that the loader uses. And you can see it's iterating and animating through these different colors that I've defined. Now, though that covers pretty much like a high level of how you would interact with the components or start using them. In terms of getting the components into your project, we'll be focusing on the simplest way to do it. So whether you're using npm or yarn or just adding some script tags to reference a CDN, the path would be the approach would be the same. We have a script tag that will point to the ES module entry point for the Calcite components. And what this will do is it'll lazy load all the components and define them in the browser so that the browser can work with them. And then we have here the link tag that will point to the global styles that some of the components share. Once you do this, you'll have access to the components in your page. So next up, what I want to do is kind of show some of the main points that you would want to do in the SDK page when it launches if you're trying to get started on a project. So first off, as a developer, I can take a look at the overview page, but specifically, I want to check out the Getting Started for Developers page. And here I can see, besides the option that we covered that we'll be using in our demos to where we access the components and styling through the CDN, you also can see instructions for the installation via npm, or if you have a Webpack bundler. There's also worth noting that the components themselves support TypeScript, so all the components are typed, and it allows you to bring in the typings in your TypeScript project and be able to get some hints at which properties accept which values. And once you kind of go through this, you can then move on to the components part. And you can explore here the library of components that are available to you. And let's take a look at Switch here. So for each one of these pages, you'll get a description of what the component does. And then next to it, you'll get a set of interactive samples where you can play with the component itself. And you also can play around with some of the options that are available on the component. So here, remember that scale property on the button. As soon as I start playing with this, you can see in runtime how it affects the size of the switch. And if I keep scrolling, I can see a collection of best practices. So these pages will also include a set of do's and don'ts for each of the components, what the proper context of the components would be. And wherever applicable, there's also a section on accessibility, and it will include information on how to use the component with the keyboard. If you once you know which component you'll be using, it'll be very useful to access the information on the APIs that are available through each of the components. And you can do that here by launching the button that will take you to the repository on GitHub that will point to the main API page, you could say. So here you can get more information on each of the properties, which values they take, their defaults, events, methods available to you, slots, if they have any, they will be docked as well, kind of giving you more information about which kind of content you can provide. So this is kind of in a nutshell what you would do to know what components you have access to, and then start planning your application. And in this next section, I'll be handing it off to Matt to show some of the things that you can do with Calcite components.
Thanks, Franco. So now I'm going to talk about how you guys can create an Esri integrated app by building an example. And the example we're going to show is a simple like survey form example using some of the Calcite components. So let's take a look at that. So here we have a basic survey, and this survey is using Calcite components such as a notice component, and then a lot of form field components such as an input, a tooltip, select, some radio buttons, a slider, a combo box, another different kind of radio group, checkboxes, a date picker, and a rating component. So let's look at some of the HTML code for this. So the first one I want to point out is the Calcite label and the Calcite switch. And this is displayed in the top right here. And what this does is it's going to toggle the components from one theme to another, so from light to dark. And how this is accomplished is by switching an attribute on the HTML body from light to dark. And I'll show the JavaScript for this at the end. The next one I wanted to point out is the notice, and this is displayed right here. So it says, please fill out your questionnaire. I can add text to it, and this will update. You can see that it's setting an icon, which is the information one by default, and it's active and it can be closed. But I can also, make it not dismissible, which will take away that close button. And I can change the icon to a banana. I'm not really sure why we have a banana icon, but it's pretty cool. The next stuff we have here is a tooltip. And so the tooltip is set up to reference an element by an ID. So here I have an ID referencing called theme help. And that is this icon right here, which has the ID of theme help. So when this icon, this Calcite icon, which is a question icon right here, when it's hovered, it's going to show that tooltip. And this is the content that's going to be shown. So that's a pretty useful component to be able to set up without writing any JavaScript. It's all handled internally by the component. We also have some form fields, such as like a select. And this is basically just internally wrapping a native select. So you'll still be able to use this on a mobile device and get the same scroll wheel experience. But what it does provide is it provides a consistent look and feel to the select and then the input, and it's all themed for Calcite. Same thing with the radio buttons. You get the Calcite look and you get a little bit of an animation. So this will look the same across all browsers. Then we have the slider component. And besides looking like Calcite, it's also very configurable. So let's look at that slider. Down, select, radio group, slider down here. So this one, there's all kinds of attributes and properties I can set, such as a number of ticks. So right now I have it to display a tick every 2 values. So I can change that to 1 and it'll render more ticks. And then you'll see more here. I can also change the min and the max and the number of steps. So just an example of how you can kind of work with these components and configure them. The next cool one is a combo box. And this one is like a multiple select. And you can also set it up to only select 1 as well. And you can remove things and kind of filter it by certain values, use a keyboard. So that's cool. And this combo box, you'll notice that it's empty inside. I'm actually populating this with JavaScript. And so I'll show that off when I get to the JavaScript section. Then I have a radio block, and this one is pretty much like a radio group, but I can also control some of its layout for not being horizontal. I can make it vertical, so it gets that kind of UI. And then we have checkboxes, which pretty similar to the radio. They just get a different look and feel, a consistent one, so that it looks like Calcite. And then we have a date picker. So here I've got a simple date picker, and I've configured it so that the max date you can input is today, and the minimum date would be the 1st of this year. And I'll show you how I'm setting that. So I'm setting it in JavaScript. It's right here, but it's just basically got the date picker tags. And then we have a rating, and I can set the default value to be 1, and you have to choose different ones. And then I have a submit button, which is a Calcite button, and that's just going to submit the form. And then I have 2 components that aren't shown right now. The first one is the Calcite Alert, and that will basically display an alert once this form is submitted. And a Calcite Progress, which will show a progress bar at the top of the form when submitted. So let's look at the CSS for this. Basically, I'm just styling the body in the HTML and positioning that theme toggle in the top right, and then positioning the progress bar, which you'll see in a second, and styling the list items and the field set. So pretty simple. Most of the style is going to be coming from the components themselves. So when the window's loaded, I'm getting the theme switch element by its ID. And then I add an event listener to that for when the switch changes. And when the switch changes, it's going to toggle the theme attribute on the body from light to dark, or vice versa. And then you'll notice that all the components will inherit that theme. For the combo box, I have an array of strings, and these are all the different components we have, and I just picked a few of them. And so I'm getting a reference to the combo box element, and then for each one of these items, I'm creating a Calcite combo box item, setting its text label to one of these values, and the value to the index, and then I'm just appending it to the combo box. So this kind of demonstrates how it's easy to work with these things. They work just like native DOM elements. For the date picker, I'm just getting a reference to it by ID, same as these ones. And I'm setting the max date as a new date object, which would be today's date. And the minimum date would be a string value of the first day of the year. Then for when the form's submitted, and I click this, it's going to tell the submit button to be loading. It's going to remove a hidden attribute on the progress, which is the top animation that happens here. And then it also sets an alert to be active. And this alert's also very configurable, where you can say it can be dismissed by a user or automatically. I have it set up to be dismissed automatically. And that just happens after 2.5 seconds. I basically undo what I did and set it to not be loading anymore. And I hide the progress again, and the alert goes away by itself. So that's it. That's a pretty simple demo of how you can just write some HTML, maybe a little bit of JavaScript, and get a consistent looking experience that will fit into Calcite apps. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Franco, and he's going to talk about building a web mapping application using Calcite Components.
Thanks, Matt. So I think it's pretty cool that Matt showed how you can take some of the different Calcite components and create a custom form experience. But now I want to talk about the fact that you also have access to some additional components that will allow you to quickly lay out the structure if you want to have an application focusing on mapping, for example. So in this next demo, I will show a web mapping application I created with the components themselves, and then just walk you through it. So with that said, here is the demo, as you can see. So when this demo loads up, we'll get a loader displayed, right? And then it is going to be fetching a web map. And once it's loaded, we'll get the title here displayed. And in this application, I have a set of actions for the user. The first group here that you see on the left panel is meant for all sorts of mapping actions, and the ones on the bottom are more specific to the app. So I can start toggling between some of these actions, and you can see if you have used the JavaScript API, it is easy to bring it over into an application along with the Calcite components and allow you to create something like this. So if I keep checking some of these actions, you can see these are using widgets from the JavaScript API. And lastly here, I have this little panel that will retrieve the more metadata behind the web map and populate it here. So I have all these map specific actions, but then I can also configure app specific ones. So in this case, I have the Tip Manager component here that, along with the Calcite tip that I showed in one of my slides, I can provide information on how to use this app. So if the user wants to, if they need to know more about what the header in this case does, or the map actions or app actions, I can give a little bit more hint about what those are, along with an associated image if I needed to. I've also added an action here if I wanted to give instructions for users on how to provide feedback for this app. And that is it for this very simple application. But now I can start focusing on the code itself, and I won't build it step by step. I'm just going to go through the main pieces of it as I talk through it. So first off, I have this loader that will show as soon as a page launches, and then it's going to go ahead and fetch the web map. Once it's loaded, this is going to show the Calcite shell. And the Calcite shell, this is the main component that I use for the single map application layout. So this will take care of the laying out the structure and giving me access to those slots and styling that I need for this sort of application. And next up, I am also using the shell panel that gives me access to this sidebar on the left. And in order to create that sidebar, I'm using the Calcite action bar along with the groups of map and app specific actions. And for each of these actions, I am just using an action and specifying the icon to show along with some helper text. And if I click on the sidebar here on the action bar, I can expand it and I can get more info on, I can get that text for each of the actions. And then afterwards, I'm just using some custom data attributes to process in my JavaScript when I'm toggling all these panels on and off. If I keep scrolling, this is the group for the app actions for the tips and the feedback modal. Afterwards, you can see I'm defining some panels, and each of these panels is going to have a heading with some additional options with that correspond to sizing. And I'm also, for each one of these, specifying a div for the JavaScript widget to attach onto. Next up, I can show the info panel that I had here. And for this one, in this panel, all that I'm doing is providing some content for the slot of the header of the panel, and also laying out some different elements that get populated at runtime when the web map loads. Next up, I have the elements here that will be slotted into the shell's header. So for this main structure, I can replace the header by using that slot. Again, it's also dynamically populated. Next up, I have the Calcite Tip Manager that I showed earlier, along with all the different tips with their image. And same as our snippet example, I have an image here and I'm using the thumbnail slot to position stuff properly. And lastly, well, not lastly, I have this Calcite modal for the feedback. And same thing, providing the slots for the header and the content. And lastly, this element will host the view for the map that you see behind us. So that's all the HTML. It's pretty straightforward. It's just using a few attributes to get a lot of the structure that you see, right? If I take a look at the CSS, you can see there's nothing crazy going on here. All the styling for all of the different pieces is contained inside of each component. All I have here is just some extra stuff for the content that I provided. And if I take a look at the JavaScript, I'll just skim through it because it's not too crazy. But all that I'm doing is I'm importing some modules from the JavaScript API. And then I've extracted methods for each of the steps. But first off, I will load the web map. Once it's ready, I will populate the header that you saw along with the info panel. And after that's ready, I will initialize the view and then wire up the actions so that for each of the actions that I click, it's going to know how to toggle the panels on and off. And lastly, once this is ready, I hide the loader and display the application. And I won't go into all these methods, but I can just maybe show this one. You can see that the components themselves, you can query for these just by using the query selector API from the browser. And then it's just a matter of accessing properties or methods, or if you wanted to listen for events as well. And if you wanted to check out the code take a closer look, you can check out the code pen, and we'll have a link at the end of our presentation if you want to check it out. So that was a demo, showed how you can use the Calcite components to quickly set up a web mapping application and just making it easier for you to start working on focusing on the mapping aspect. And before moving on, I just wanted to call out that the Calcite components are being used right now. If you've seen the new map viewer, that's already using Calcite components. And we also have some projects and products from Esri Professional Services, and there's also GeoJo that is using Calcite components. And we've had a lot of good feedback saying that by using the components, we are freeing up developer time to focus on the main aspect of their apps instead of trying to think of the theming, the styling, and the layout of their apps. So it just takes all that away from them so they can focus on the main parts of the app. And just to recap, we talked about what the Calcite design system is, what it is meant to do. Then we also covered the benefits of using the components, such as having a consistent experience, making it easier to have a set of components that you can pull into your apps. They're accessible. We also talked about the different building blocks that are used to create the Calcite components. We showed some of the main concepts that you need to keep in mind before you start working with Calcite components in your own custom apps. And lastly, we showed a few demos that showed the different contexts where you can start using Calcite components. Before wrapping up, I did want to call out some additional Calcite sessions. If you wanted to learn more, we have these. If you wanted to kind of learn more about the Calcite components and how to use them. And there will be a link next up just to, if you didn't get a chance to write these up. Before I forget, please.
Franco, the session I did with Julio, the recording's already available, and the other one is actually right after this session, so everyone can join that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And before I forget, make sure to please give us feedback on this session so that we can improve it in the future. We would really appreciate that. With that, we can move on to questions. So if you want to check out the slides and the source, you can go to this bit.ly link that we have here, or if you have a question for the Calcite team, you can also check out this other link and submit your question. And with that, we can open it up.
Okay. So we've had some questions come in during the presentation, and I'm just going to start going through them. So, oh, by the way, I'm Julie Powell, and I work with Franco and Matt on the JavaScript API and Calcite. Okay, so the first question is, what are the major differences or positioning among Calcite, Experience Builder, and Web App Builder? I think the fundamental thing to keep in mind is Experience Builder and Web App Builder is really for when you're wanting to configure an application or have like a fully built app where you're just customizing it, adding your custom widgets or themes, but it is like a full application that you're working with. And in those cases, those are builder environments where you can use it to configure apps. Whereas Calcite's really the fundamental UI building blocks for creating custom applications. So that it's really more targeting the custom apps. Now, that being said, many of our apps do use Calcite for the design. So you'll see templates, the web application templates they'll be using Calcite. We're also planning to create a theme in Experience Builder that will be a Calcite theme. So that there is some integration there, but it's really kind of the, do you want to build a custom app? And these are the, the UI building blocks like buttons and accordions and the things that Franco and Matt showed, or are you looking for a simple, configuration, perhaps just build a widget type implementation. Okay, so there was a question that came early on in the session before Franco had presented about layouts. But there's a question, how about layout panels, collapsible elements? Matt, do you want to add anything to what Franco presented with the layouts for that question?
No, I think that's it. There are some components that do specifically layout things, such as an application Calcite shell and panels. So there maybe we didn't get to that section yet, but there are some that do layout content. Yeah, and I think throughout the year we would like to add more samples demonstrating some of the different layouts you can do, and also in the next session you'll probably see some more as well. Okay, would it make sense to potentially use Calcite controls in a non-ArcGIS web application? And if so, would there be a licensing implication for this? You absolutely can use Calcite with any web API. There's no requirement to use our JavaScript API. The two do go really well together. The fact that the JavaScript API design of the widgets was really modeled with Calcite. So they really work well together. There's absolutely no reason that you have to use that, especially from a licensing perspective, especially if you're using any of the ArcGIS platform services. We require that you create a developer account and you can start using Calcite. All of the licensing details will be published in the developer website upon release on April 22nd. Okay, next question. Is Calcite designed more for beginner web designers, GIS drag and drop configuration, or expert code writers? Matt, you want to take that one? Sure. So I guess it's all of the above. It's for anyone. You can use them in some kind of advanced application or using JSX, or you can just use them as basic DOM elements. So it's kind of up to you. It's for anyone that wants a consistent Calcite look and feel in their application.
Cool. Would it make sense to potentially use Calcite controls? Oh, sorry, I already did that one. When will the library and documentation be released? So this will be released on April 22nd. Pretty soon. Can this be integrated into Web App Builder, or is it only for 3x, 4x JavaScript API? Matt, you want to tackle that?
Sure, it can be implemented anywhere. So any application, framework, whatever you want. I don't know if they're using any Calcite components at this time. I don't know. Julie, you can take that part maybe.
Yeah, so I've actually seen the implementation using Web App Builder with Calcite, but it's, I wouldn't recommend taking that approach. Primarily because you do have to go in and change some of the JMU framework. So it's absolutely possible, but you actually have to dig into the framework code, which might be fine for your use case, but it there's considerations for maintenance and upgrade of Web App Builder if you're going to modify the internal framework. So yeah, like Matt said, it is possible, and it does mean that you're going to kind of go in there and have to change some of the framework code. So, okay, next question. Does the Calcite design system support both desktop, web, and mobile devices? Matt, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so it supports any web device. So if it's using a browser on mobile or desktop, it's going to work, and they are responsive, so it'll work there. But if you want a native mobile app, it should work, but we haven't done any of that testing yet. So I don't know if you want to add anything, Franco.
No, I think you covered it well. As it's just as long as you think of these as elements in the browser. Like if your device can run the browser, it can use the components, assuming they follow those browsers that we mentioned.
Yeah, it's a good rule of thumb. If it will work with DOM elements, it'll work with these. So yeah.
And I'm not sure if you meant like just web mobile app, like it's definitely designed to be responsive. Most web apps, you have to assume you'll be used on a desktop or mobile device. So these guys definitely did a good job making sure that you have the ability to adapt well to both screen sizes. Is there a feature table component, Matt?
There is a feature table component in the works or in like the plan. It's not available yet, but it is in the roadmap. So in the future, we will have something.
And then we also have the feature table in the ArcGIS API for JavaScript.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And that is Calcite themed. So.
Do the inputs have validation message capabilities, Franco?
Yes, I believe there are validation. There is support for validation in the input, but we still we'll be working on improving how inputs work with forms in general moving forward. But there is some support there.
Okay, there's another question about layouts, but I think we covered it. That was an early question that we got. What about events? Franco, do you want to talk about that one?
Sure. So all the components in terms of the events, they're using native custom events. So you are able to listen to them as if they were emitted from an HTML input or an HTML select, same way.
And then that'll all be documented in the developer side as well on per component. Okay, there's a question. Is Calcite directly related to Calcite maps that your colleague Alan Laframboise had on GitHub for a while? Matt, you want that one?
Yeah, sure. So it's related in the sense that it's an evolution from Calcite maps and those other Calcite projects that were out on GitHub. So as Calcite's evolved, it's kind of evolved into these components. So that project is still available, although I think maybe it's deprecated now. Going forward, Calcite components will be like the standard way of developing a Calcite application using Calcite components and the Calcite design system.
Right. Yeah, and also, there are configurable apps that you can use that will be using Calcite if you really like the Calcite design. So yeah, we are that one is already deprecated. Is the table filtering, sorting, and paging feature available with Calcite library? I think we answered that one, Matt, with the feature table question. Mark that one as answered. Will these demos be made available on GitHub? Did you share your link? You did share a link. Okay, so you guys should have that access to that GitHub repo. Can we create a toolbar? I think that's what you showed, Franco. Or Matt, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, we do have a toolbar, which is called the action bar component. And we also have an action pad component, which is more of a floating toolbar. So both of those can be used in application, and they are currently used in the new map viewer. So you can check them out there as well.
Will the Calcite icon and UI kit be available in Adobe XD, and when? So right now with this first release, we have support for Sketch, and we have plans, and actually a lot of the work is already done to integrate into Figma. I believe we're shooting to have that around the summer timeframe. It's looking really good. And Adobe XD is also planned sometime this year. We don't have a specific date yet, but those are the three we plan to support. Is there support in Calcite components for persistence, holding state across multiple sessions in same browser and or same user? Franco, you want that one?
Sure. So depending on the component, if they, some may support persistence, and if basically if, for example, a color picker, it stores all the saved colors that you have. So there's an attribute where you can give it an ID, and whenever that ID is set on that component, it means that it's going to save all of its data with that ID in mind. And So whenever you refresh the page or come back to it, it'll be there. So it really depends on the components that implement this persistence, but there are a few that will use it.
Cool. Can I use this design library with web app framework like Angular? Franco, you want to do that?
Sure. Yeah, you should be able to. It's Angular allows you to create custom elements. Sorry, to create elements. So we should be good there.
And we have a sample, right?
I can't recall. I think we do have one.
Yeah, Calcite examples. I think they have an Angular example
cool.
and other frameworks as well.
Nice. Yeah, and also if you're using TypeScript in Angular for version 2, you'll have the typings as well, making it easier.
Are all Calcite components available in the new map viewer? Matt?
So most of them are used in the new map viewer. So I think that's what the question might be asking. But not every single one is used in the map viewer. Some are using different applications that we have, but they all can be used in the new map viewer.
Yeah, it's definitely heavy use in the map viewer. Yeah, I'm also not sure what this person is looking for. If you have more questions, you can also post them in the Esri community or the link that Franco shared. Is there support for configurable applications with Calcite? I'm not sure if this question is about the web apps that are configurable through ArcGIS Online, ArcGIS Enterprise. If that's the case, yes, actually the whole experience for configuration is implemented with Calcite now for the whole template configuration. And we plan to have, going forward, templates will be using Calcite in many cases. We also will be working on samples that will be available through the developer site. So you can just use the code and use that as a starting point for your application using Calcite. But I guess I should add that, it's really, like I mentioned in the beginning, Calcite's really aimed for, custom apps and not as much configurable. So if you're really, truly looking for a configurable app, you should be using the web application templates or one of the other options we have. There's a question about responsiveness, and I said a few words about it. But Matt, do you want to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the sizings and the breakpoints and how you implement a responsive app with Calcite?
Yeah, sure. So all of the components are developed to be responsible. There's also options on most of the components for setting a scale, and we have 3 different sizes for that. We also have a lot of CSS variables that can define some of the scaling for the components. So there's a variety of ways you can configure them to be responsive in your app, and they're designed with that in mind. They're also most of them are set up to be display as flex by default, so they will kind of adapt to where you put them.
Cool. There was a question about using Calcite with React. Matt, do you want to talk about, and there's also an under the hood question about how we basically create the web components. Do you want to say a few words about Stencil in our plans for React?
Sure. So yeah, under the hood, we use Stencil Js to create the web components. And as far as React support, it works except for I believe the custom event bindings. And so there is a website you can kind of check the status on that. I think it's called Web Components Everywhere. Franco, correct me if I'm wrong, where it kind of shows how frameworks compare and what kind of support they're lacking for web components. But React works. It's just the custom events that need a little bit of tweaking.
I think the website is Custom Elements Everywhere. And
yeah, okay. Custom elements
in terms of React, that's the framework that is not doing so great in that. Pretty much everything else is good to go for custom elements. But the main reason is because React has its own synthetic event system. And for that, there are some plans to provide a React specific output target to make it easier to consume the components in a React context. It's just not available yet.
Yeah, I saw that. I think that would be a great idea. Okay, well, we have one more minute to the session. I also wanted to again mention that there's one more session today on Calcite. It's more focused for designers and using Sketch to design your app and then how to build it as a developer. Let's see, is there any other questions that we want to take? Actually, the time's up. Definitely follow up with us if you have more questions. You can do that in the Esri community or via the links that were shared. And yeah, we're really excited to see what you guys build. So thanks so much for attending, and thanks to Franco and Matt.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.